Good evening. Good evening, everyone over here, and welcome to the final class of Purim in the Talmud series, part 4. And tonight we're going to be talking. My plan is we will endeavor for the next hour to divide up into two parts. Tonight's going to be divided into two parts. For those who have the handouts in front of you, there's part 1 you see in front of you, and in 2 pages in you'll see part 2. Part 1, we're going to be talking about practical laws. We're going to stick to the theme of what I posted and advertised, Purim, but how. We're going to go over several of the laws of Purim and clarify them for all of us. And then we're going to talk into a little bit of insight. You know, the clothing of a person spiritually is machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh, thought, speech, and action in that order. But since Purim is v'napachu, because in Purim we switch things around, so we're going to talk ma'aseh first, practical laws, and then we move into dibur and machshava. We move into a little bit of appetizers for the soul and the insights of Purim, and finishing off with the thought that counts. So we go backwards. All right. So, how do you do Purim? How do you do Purim? So, we're going to talk about the Megillah, followed by Mishloach Manot, giving gifts, sharing gifts with people, Matas Lavyonim, money for the poor, and then finishing off with Sudat Purim, the Purim feast. So, the reading of the Megillah, to start off, the reading of the Megillah is very, very important. In your handout, the one thing I forgot to do when I created the source sheet before printing it out was actually to number it. Usually it says source 1, source 2. I forgot to do that. But the first one, the obligation to read the Megillah is by night and by day. So we each have an obligation to hear it twice. And usually, and unlike when it comes to prayer, for example, if you miss the evening prayers, you can make it up for the daytime. This doesn't work by the Megillah. So there's obligation by night and by day. If you miss the nighttime, you don't have to hear it by day twice. You miss it. But the obligation of hearing the Megillah once by night and once by day. By the way, side note, which one is more important, the nighttime or the daytime? So the truth is both of them are equally important. However, if you want to compare subtly which one is more important, it's actually the daytime. The daytime Megillah reading is technically more important. Where's the practical difference? The practical difference in halachic terms is actually if one is in doubt if they actually heard a word. The obligation is to hear every single word of the Megillah, every single syllable that is uttered by the person reading the Megillah. We each have an obligation to hear it, every single word. If one did not hear every single word, they actually did not fulfill the obligation. We have to hear every single word. What's the practical difference? What if I'm not sure if I heard a word? I'm in doubt. So that's the difference. By nighttime, if I'm in doubt, I don't have to hear Megillah again. By daytime, I do. That's the subtle difference. If I'm in doubt whether I heard one word of the Megillah or not, by daytime I hear it again. By nighttime I don't. That's one practical difference. A second practical difference as to understand why the reading of the Megillah by daytime is slightly more important than by night is simply that it's by daytime when we hear the Shehecheyanu blessing, the person reading the Megillah recites the Shehecheyanu, we have in mind, while we listen to that, we have in mind to fulfill our obligation with the other 3 mitzvahs of Purim that we will fulfill that day. So when we hear the Megillah and we hear the person saying the blessing Shehecheyanu, we have in mind that Shehecheyanu is also going to fulfill, is also making a blessing, adding into account the other 3 mitzvahs, namely Mishloach Manos, giving gifts, Matanas Lavyonim, money to the poor, and Sudas Purim, the Purim feast, which we'll talk about. Okay? So, another thing. Number 2 over here, talking about the importance of Megillah, not to mistake the fact that the night Megillah is not important at all. We even say, as this is halacha Shulchan Aruch, or Chaim Tafresh Pezayin Sibbeis, Mevatel Talmud Torah L'Shmei Megillah. We even cancel Torah learning to hear the Megillah. All the more so when it comes to other mitzvahs of the Torah, everything gets pushed away because of the Megillah. That's how important hearing the Megillah is. Very important. We actually had this discussion. In Tractate Brachos before we actually delved into Purim, as to practical difference. What would happen? What do we do if you're in the middle of reading the Megillah and you look outside? It's Purim that got pushed off. It was Shabbos. It got pushed off to Sunday. So therefore, the night that you read the Megillah happens to be Matzai Shabbos, Saturday night, right after Shabbos is over. What if someone is reading the Megillah, in the middle of the Megillah, they look outside and they see, you know what, for the past week it was cloudy outside, the moon never came out, and I see in the middle of the Megillah, he's in the middle of reading the Megillah, he sees the moon came out. It's the night of the 14th. He's going to miss his opportunity to make Kiddush Levana, to sanctify the moon, which is a mitzvah. So what goes first? Does he stop the Megillah reading and go out and sanctify the moon and continue? Or do we say he has to finish the Megillah and worry about the moon later? So we ended up saying over there that although technically min hadin, the essential point of the law is that he can nullify, better that he finishes off the Megillah reading because he's in the middle of it and deal with the moon afterwards. We see over here the importance of the Megillah. Just to make mention, this whole thing about, if you look further on, you can see the end of the second source. It actually says, this, by the way, the big letters represents the Beis Yosef. This is the big Shulchan Aruch, the big Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Yosef Cairo. And later on, simultaneously, while he was putting together the book of Jewish Law, there was another. He was living in Israel, and he was writing based on the customs of the Sephardim. Simultaneously, there was another Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, who was living in Krakow, I believe, and he was busy putting together Code of Jewish Law himself. But when he heard that the holy Rabbi Yosef Cairo was putting together a Code of Jewish Law, he said to himself, rather than me making a separate book, I'm going to, he started first, I'll let him finish the Code of Jewish Law, and I'll add, he calls himself the Shulchan Aruch, which literally means a set table, Code of Jewish Law. I'm going to just add footnotes to insert the Ashkenazic Jewry, to insert their customs, and he called his work the Mappa, the tablecloth. There's the set table, and he put the mappa on top. So, showing out of great respect for Rabbi Yosef Cairo. So the smaller letters in Hebrew, you don't see it in English, but the small letters in Hebrew are the footnotes of Rabbi Moshe Isserlich showing the Ashkenazi customs. You see it where it says Ramah. Halfway into the paragraph, you see Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlich. This is his writings. And he basically points out that when do we say that Megillah pushes away everything else? That is only when you don't have time to do two things. You're time pressed so badly that you cannot do two things. You have to choose to do one thing or the other. But if you have time to do the other thing, then you have to do that mitzvah first, obviously. The mitzvah from the Torah, therefore, does come first. So this is one of the powers of the sages, because the reading of the Megillah itself is not even a biblical commandment. It's a rabbinical commandment. And yet the rabbis actually have the power that they were able to push this off and move further. Okay. I just added a few more interesting things about the reading of the Megillah. Based on the verse Beroiv Am Hadras Melech, that we glorify mitzvot when we do it with multitudes, with a lot of people. Therefore, the best way to hear the Megillah is with a minyan, with 10 people. And some people say that it's just about making multitudes, it's all about a crowd. So even 10 people that consists of men, women, children, it's good. It's a good thing. The only practical difference is if we don't have a minyan, then the blessing that is said right after the hearing of the Megillah, which is called Harav Esrivenu. There's a paragraph that we say with a blessing. The Valkyrie says that. If there's no minyan, we don't say that. Another thing, everyone is obligated. Men and women are both obligated in the reading of the Megillah. Everyone is obligated in that, in hearing the Megillah. Children are not necessarily obligated to hear the Megillah. However, we do so anyways, based on custom. We want to get our children to become more involved, and it's for educational purposes. And if we do that when they are young, then surely they will do that as they grow older. They'll understand the importance of it. And therefore, that is why, on the other side of the page over here in the third source, I bring to you that the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says it straight out. Minag Tov lahavi ketanim ketanas l'shmei mikra Megillah is a good tradition to bring male and female children to hear the reading of the Megillah, because it's very important. I just want to add another two things, and that is reading of the Megillah must be live, not on Skype, not FaceTime. It has to be live. You cannot even hear an echo from it in a side room. You need to be hearing it live from the person. We spoke already about hearing every single word. Therefore, obviously, we need to be quiet because we have to hear every word. Interesting. Someone that knows how to read the Megillah should read the Megillah. This is the code of Jewish law. Someone that knows how to lane, we call it, or even knows how to read the words, is obligated to read the Megillah. Everyone who knows how to read needs to read. Now, what if you don't know how to read? That is when the Balkari takes care of business for you, and you fulfill the obligation of the Megillah through the Balkari, through the one reading the Megillah. However, why am I saying this, that everyone is obligated? If, for this reason, by the way, it is customary for many people, if you can afford it, to buy your own Megillah, if you know how to read, to beautify the mitzvah. But why am I saying this? Because if you do know how to read, it is customary to actually read along with the Balkari, albeit quietly. To quietly say the words together with the Balkari, because if you know how to read the Megillah, it is better that you say it and not rely on somebody else. And you might see it. Next week, Purim night, you might see it. You'll see people opening up the Megillahs, and you might see them reading quietly.
You got two questions.
Yes.
First things first. When did they come up with the thing where you have to hear it live? They didn't have, audiovisual systems back in the day.
I added that in.
Oh.
Live as opposed to being in the next room.
Okay. And then
similar to the mitzvah of shofar. The mitzvah of shofar in Rosh Hashanah, we must hear it live in the room as opposed to hearing an echo of it in the next room.
And the second question is, our Baal Kurums they read at warp speed. So how are we supposed to, read it ourselves?
I'll share that. It will be a discussion that we'll discuss further. Okay. For the record, I agree with you. Okay. Now, Mishloach Manos. For Mishloach Manos. So, the actual mitzvah of Mishloach Manos is codified on the opposite side of your sheet on the bottom. That is the bottom one. Ideally, some say that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos, it should be portions of meat. Mishloach Manos. Manos means gifts, plural. Ish l're'ehu. In order to fulfill obligation, you give to one person 2 types of food. Some people say it's good to give meat. However, the general understanding is that it's any food stuff, any foods. In fact, some people are of the custom, and it's been a widespread accepted custom, to have 2 different types of foods of 2 different blessings. For example, fruit together with a hamatash, where one makes a mezonot on the hamatash and one makes a eitz on the fruit, etc., etc. People have all different types of customs. But based on the actual Jewish law, 2 foods is good enough, even if it's the same blessing. It doesn't have to be meat, and one fulfills obligation anyways. And this, that we add 2 different types of blessings, meats, it's an added beautified mitzvah, but one fulfills obligation even without those things, to clarify. Some people have a custom that they do it through a shaliach, so that if, let's say, I want to give Shmuel David, I want to give him Mishloach Manos, I would give it over to Penny and say, Penny, you hand it in my name too. There are some people who have the custom to do that. Where does it stem from? To put it simply, the idea stems from the more the merrier. The more people that you involve in the mitzvahs of Purim, the merrier it is. It's not necessary though. What I mean by necessary is you can obviously give to someone direct, and you fulfill the obligation as well. Just to put it out there, because you might see some people do that, and the idea is it's beautifying the mitzvah by inviting more people to be involved. If I have to give to you, if I'm giving to you anyways, let me give to you through somebody else, that person's involved in the giving of Mishloach Manos, and it enhances the festivities. Men give to men, women give to women. Let's face it, some women would feel very uncomfortable if you're giving them Mishloach Manos, and vice versa. But that's the way it is. Men give to men, women give to women. Therefore, it's important to note, if you are a family, it's important to note that that lest you think that the idea of Mishloach Manos is just, let's say, on behalf of the family. So one person gets into the car, drives around and delivers all the Mishloach Manos, and the other one stays at home. The other person wasn't really fulfilling the Mishloach Manos. The men give to the men, the women give to the women. And that's basically the way it works. Children don't have to, of course, but they are encouraged to. And the best thing to do if you have kids is to encourage them, bring them into the car, to go around and give Mishloach Manos. It's, again, it's all about enhancing the festivities and getting them excited about the festivities of Purim. An Avel, someone who is in their year of mourning, if they've lost a family member in the 30 days, or if somebody lost one of their parents and it's within the year of mourning, the way it works is that they give just one Mishloach Manos. And in turn, the other people who know that that person's an Avel, we don't make a big thing to bring them huge amounts of Mishloach Manos. Why? We shouldn't experience this, but Avelim know this. There's a concept that we minimize. We minimize festivities during the year of Avelos. So therefore, one fulfills obligation. He gives one Mishloach Manos to somebody, and that's it. Not to say, for example, if let's say you're a family, you have a family, and you have a whole long list of people you want to give Mishloach Manos for, well, what do you mean I just give one? How does that work? Don't forget the wife, or don't forget the husband. Their spouse may not be an Avel, and the spouse will be able to give out all of the Mishloach Manos. But the Avel personally gives just one, for the sake of the mitzvah, but we don't make a big deal. Okay. Adding, person that gives Mishloach Manos should be in town. Should be in town. If the person's not in town, that means obviously that person's not going to be receiving it that day. You haven't fulfilled it. Likewise, it has to be done during the daytime. It has to be done during the daytime. Ideally, after you hear the Megillah, after you hear the Shechianu blessing from the Balkari and have in mind the other mitzvah. If you end up giving it before the hearing of the Megillah and the sunrise already, you end up giving Mishloach Manos before the Megillah, that's also fine. You also fulfilled it. But you do not fulfill it by night. Now, practical suggestion. You are planning to give Mishloach Manos to 180 people. You only have one vehicle available, and it's not practical and realistic for you to be able to give all the Mishloach Manos that you want to give in one day. So what do? Practical suggestion. Give some at night. Okay, you didn't fulfill the obligation with those, but you're going to give some during the day anyways. So therefore, it's not to say that you cannot give at nighttime. You just, those gifts that you give at nighttime wasn't the one that fulfills that obligation. All you need is one of them to be given by day, and you're good to go, and the rest of them just enhances the mitzvah, but you fulfilled your obligation already. So just a practical suggestion for those that have intention of giving a lot, which is obviously a beautiful thing. If someone is not in town, what you could do is you could notify them that you're dropping off, and then they are thinking about it, and they have in mind that they are receiving it, etc., etc. Now, what if a person, Hashem blessed many of us in this town, that bike week is this week and not next week, but let's think about it. What if Thursday Purim was during bike week, and someone is very, very busy? They have stores on Main Street, and it's very, very busy, and they're there the whole day, and they don't have any time during the day to give out Mishloach Manos. So what should they do? So you can give through a shliach. You can. Like we said before, some people even have a custom that every time they give Mishloach Manos, they give it through a shliach, they give it through an emissary. You can give it through a shliach. So if you have a shliach do it for you with the intention, he's representing you, or for women, she's representing her, they fulfill the obligation as well. You can fulfill the obligation that way. Okay, Matanos Levyonim, moving on. Matanos Levyonim, money to the poor. Matanos, gifts. La'evyonim, to poor peoples, plural. What that means is, two different people, that's the mitzvah. Two different people to give money to the poor. This is...
Specifically money?
What was that?
Specifically money?
Specifically money, yes. Specifically money. And now, I'm just going to add in over here on the third page, I included 2 halachas. One should not change money that was given to the poor for Purim. For the Ramah writes that this is talking about the collectors. Someone that's collecting money from Matanas Levyonim, the money that's been given to them for that purpose, they are not allowed to appropriate it for anything else. They cannot decide, oh, I'm falling short of my gas bill, I'm going to pay for my gas bill with that money. Then they have to use it. But that's the collector. The poor person who receives it, they can do whatever they want with it. That's a halacha. Now there's a special point when it comes to the Matanas Levyonim, and that is, this is the second one on the third page. We tend to not be meticulous as to the exact amounts when it comes to giving. There's an importance on Purim. Kol hapoishet shepoishet yad little noisnim lo. Kol hapoishet yad nisnim lo. Whoever he stretches out their hand for tzedakah, we give to them, and we give. And there's a concept you pull out and you give without really looking at how much you're giving to each person. It's actually a nice thing. It's a very nice thing, and Yosef Kari says even on Purim, if there's a place that's customary that even non-Jews come and ask you for money, then we give on Purim to non-Jews as well. If someone comes and asks for money, we give them, and that's it. Now, how much is the minimum amount? Most are of the opinion that it's a pruta, anything of value. However, others maintain that ideally what you should be doing is when you give money to the poor, it should be enough for them to buy a single meal, that they can feed themselves. So let's give a number, practically speaking, in today's day, let's say that's about $10. Practically, go to the store, with $10 you could probably buy a full loaf of sliced bread, together with a drink, and some peanut butter or cream cheese to put it on. Let's say about $10 is you can get a meal. You walk into Eden Fresh, you can probably get a meal for $10. Mm-hmm. Thank God for them. So let's say $10, or some people do give $18 as well. But specifically we give to 2 different things, either to 2 different poor people. If you don't know of any poor people, you can give it to an organization. It's actually, in a way, it's actually better that you give it to an organization, because poor people are usually too embarrassed to ask, but the person who's collecting knows exactly who to give it to, and giving it to them in itself is as if you gave it to the poor person, because the collector is an extended hand of the poor person. Nowadays, if you don't know an organization, or if you don't have an organization nearby, setting aside money is also permitted. If you set aside money, say this is for charity, you fulfill the obligation. Nowadays, not just 2019, but for the past 10 years at least, there's no such thing nowadays as not having an organization nearby. You can simply go online, and there are hundreds, unfortunately, there are hundreds of organizations, because there are so many needy people out there. All you do is go online and swipe your credit card, enter your credit card details, and you can easily give to 2 different organizations on the day of Purim to fulfill your obligation. And many people, they say straight out, these organizations, they tell you straight on the webpage, they tell you straight out, the money is going to the poor people today. On the day of Purim, it will be given to them. So you fulfill your obligation that way.
Those Purim baskets have a spot for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, I know in South Florida they even have this concept. I saw this just recently. And for the past 5 years, they've been doing this. Many organizations they give you cards. Let's say a $5 card or a $10 card, and you basically give it to people. You go to the people in your community, and they receive a card that says, $5 has been donated to this organization in your merit, on your behalf or in your merit. So it's also a beautiful thing. Okay, moving on. Sudas Purim. One should try to wash hamaitzi and have bread. It's also important that one should try to eat meat. So, just like a Yom Tov meal. However, if you don't have bread, and we don't have meat, you can fulfill the obligation with mezuzah pastry. Ideally, hamotzi, ideally to have meat. And especially important that we should try to make this meal more festive than other meals. It's important that in the community, your family, your kids, your community members, it's important that we make the festivities of Purim much more festive than usual, that will be enticing for people to take part in it. And later on, when we get to the insights of Purim, we'll explain why. Now, the halacha that I presented to you on the bottom of this page, Chayiv inish l'psumi b'Purim, ad lo yada ben arham l'barach manachai. This is a very famous law. And that is, a person's obligated to partake in drinking wine on Purim until the point that they don't know the difference between curses Haman and blesses Mordechai. So most people maintain that means literally intoxicating yourself until the point of drunkenness. It's interesting, I'm going to point out that the Ramah, right here in this very halacha, already puts out, in the beginning of his footnotes, already makes a yesh omrim, that some say that it's not necessary to become so drunk. And some people, he quotes the Kolbai, one of the Rishonim, one of the earlier commentaries, that just by drinking wine enough to make you drowsy and fall asleep, that's also good enough. While you're sleeping, then you can't tell the difference because you're sleeping. The Hasidic interpretation is you learn Hasidus. You learn some Hasidus until the point when you've reached such a lofty level of understanding of Hasidus that Einod Muvade, that everything in this world is the same. It doesn't make a difference. The Haman, the Mordechai, it's all the same through the study of Hasidus. So therefore, everyone to their thing. However, it is still important that we should make a little more l'chaim than usual, drink a little more wine than usual, to show on this concept. There is a concept that we drink a little more than usual. This su'udah needs to be done by day. It needs to be done by day. Generally, people do it in the afternoon, just simply because the whole day they're busy giving out shalach manas, they're giving out matanas l'avyonim, they're busy doing all the other mitzvahs, and therefore it gets pushed off till later. Obviously, you could do the soda at any time during the day, and it's fine. Practically, we usually do it in the afternoon because of the reasons given before. It needs to be done by day. If you start by a day and you finish off by night, that's also fine, as long as you start while it's still daylight. That's basically it. That's basically it with the 4 mitzvahs. Any questions?
As far as Minka Marav and eating beforehand and that sort of thing.
The special prayers that we add in? Yes, we add in a special prayer called Al Hanisim. The Al Hanisim that we say on Hanukkah and on Purim, and we include it in our Midah davening. By daytime, we have a reading of the Torah, special reading of the Torah speaking about Amalek and getting rid of Amalek, the war of Amalek. And then the way it works is by nighttime, right after the evening services, we read the Megillah. And if it's a fast day, we traditionally do the reading of the Megillah before we break our fast. However, if you can't hold it, then you can drink something. That's fine. Because you daven Marv already, because you daven the evening services, if you can't hold it, you can drink something.
Zrizin is really fast also.
It's also really fast.
But what about...
By daytime, we read the Megillah right after the reading of the Torah.
But isn't there a minhag as far as not eating before Mincha?
Not eating before Mincha?
Yeah. Aren't you supposed to wait till after Mincha to eat?
The soda, the actual meal?
Yeah.
Well, the reason for that stemming to what I said earlier, because people are involved with mitzvahs the whole day.
Yeah.
However, even though that's what we practically do, it's not necessary.
Okay. Is the portion on Amalek the same that is
read in this Shabbos?
Yes.
It's different. Twice in the Torah, Amalek is mentioned. Once in the Torah portion of Beshalach. Torah portion of Beshalach actually describes the story of Amalek attacking the Jewish people. That is read on Purim. What we are reading on Shabbos is the Torah portion of Kisetze. The Torah portion of Kisetze, which is in Deuteronomy, which is in the 5th book of the Torah, much later. And that's the paragraph that's part of the 6 remembrances that we say at the conclusion of prayer. We say, Zachar es asher asalach al Amalek, remember what Amalek did to you. That 5-line paragraph. It's 2 different ones.
Why?
Yes. Why are there 2 different ones?
If this one actually is because of the approach of Purim, and you say one specifically on Purim, why would they be different?
So let me understand your question. Your question is, why would we not, what we read in the Shabbos, why wouldn't we say that on Purim? The truth is, so in answer to your question, the truth is the obligation to remember what Amalek did is included in both Torah portions. And the truth of the matter is, halacha, the Jewish law actually tells us that if you miss this Shabbos reading, you can fulfill your obligation by coming and hearing the Torah reading on Purim itself. So in essence, you can fulfill the obligation on Purim as well. Because both of them say, Ki machai emcha ez zecher Amalek, I'm going to erase the remembrance of Amalek. That and similar wording in Kisetzi as well. So both have this concept of eradicating the remembrance of Amalek and remembering what Amalek did to us. So we actually have both. Okay, I hope that answered your question. Okay, let's touch the two different foods. Several foods. We're talking about several foods, and then we move into some insights. So we have several foods that we traditionally eat on Purim. By the way, before I get to the main one, the Ramah brings an interesting one over here, and this is the last source of part 1. Brings the opinion of. By the way, Danny, I forgot to mention, the Ramah himself actually brings this custom about making the Su'udah, the meal of Purim, after Mincha prayer. He actually says it includes it over here.
Here it's going to be dark.
Over here it's going to be dark, first of all. Oh no, we usually pray earlier. We usually do it like 5 o'clock.
You can do it earlier.
Well, you can do it earlier. But anyways, like I said before, that's a custom. But if someone's not going to have time, they can always do it earlier. Okay, but he does bring over here that there are opinions that people eat seeds. Seeds. Any type of seeds. Why? To remember Daniel. Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they ate seeds in Babylon. Now we know that the story of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah took place right before Purim, and it's all part of Galus Bavel. This whole story took place in the exile of Bavel, so therefore it's all connected anyways. The most famous foods that we eat on Purim, we got chocolate ones right here, Haman Tashin, or Aznei Haman. Aznei Haman. What is the idea of eating Haman Tashin? So, there are several reasons. First of all, you'll notice the Haman Tash, the way it's designed, it has an outer part to it, the outer pastry, and it has a filling inside. The idea is that the outside is concealing what's in the inside. The whole theme of Purim is everything that you see around you, it's not what it seems. It's not always what it seems to be. And the whole idea of Purim is about concealment. So because you have an outer pastry concealing what's inside, showing that sometimes what we deem reality is concealing the truth. That's one reason for Hamantash. Another reason for Hamantash is that Chazal, our rabbis, tell us that Haman gazed at and envisioned the Avos, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and he was crushed. That's what the sages say. So you think about 3 people, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, you have a triangle. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob represents the 3 patriarchs who crushed Haman through a vision. Another one is of the opinion that after Haman, with his downfall, he was stooped over. So like you kind of think of the triangle, imagine someone that's stooped over. Some people say that's Haman's hat. Couldn't really figure out where that came from. It's a nice idea. Another food, by the way, especially in the Ashkenazi community, is to eat kreplach. Kreplach, to explain what kreplach is, the closest common food that I can compare it to is meat ravioli. Basically, where you have the meat and surrounded by dough stuffing. Dough covering over a meat stuffing, meat filling. Many people cook it. The idea is the same idea. You have meat that's being concealed by being wrapped in something else. Another, one last thing I'm going to say about the things about Purim, the customs, before we move on to insights, is the idea of costumes. Everyone dresses up on Purim. What's that about? What's the reason for dressing up on Purim? So, in short, the main reason is because v'na'apechu. The Megillah itself says v'na'apechu asher ishlatu hayudim hema b'seinehim. Everything got changed around, flipped around. Everything flipped on its back. And on one hand, we were experiencing downfall, and then suddenly v'na'apechu, everything changed around. So therefore, based on that custom, we change ourselves and we become somebody else for a day. We change. We also have v'napech, we become someone else for a day. So that the rabbi becomes the lawyer becomes the businessman becomes the doctor, and hopefully they're not giving their advice in the people that they're pretending to be. Right? Another reason for dressing up in costumes is to remember Esther, Queen Esther, that she hid her identity. That the entire time that she was queen, until the moment that she was pressed and she had to reveal her identity, nobody knew she was Jewish, nobody knew her origins. So to commemorate that, we hide our identity by dressing up. Another reason Hashem's name is hidden in the Megillah. We're going to talk about that later. And some even say that the reason we dress up is to make it more comfortable for those who are needy to ask for money. It's kind of like, I remember a long time ago, Robin Williams, and I'm not going to say everything that he says, but some things that he said, he spoke about the concept I remember called legalized insanity. That sometimes when you're in a certain setting you can become crazy and it's fine. He said like when you're an actor you can be crazy and it's fine. But the idea is on Purim, if someone's in need of money and they see everyone's dressing up like clowns, it's more comfortable for them to ask for money. So we are actually helping other people by dressing up to make other people who are in need be more comfortable to stretch out their hand and ask for help. So based on that reasoning, it's actually a very beautiful thing that we are dressing up. So as you can see, many reasons, nothing to do with Halloween. Nothing. Okay. That's basically it. That's basically it for part 1. Purim, but how? I'm going to move right away into part 2. Part 2, we are going to explore chapter 9 in the Megillah, speaking about how the whole story was documented by Mordechai and Esther, and how it was submitted to be established for all future generations that we commemorate Purim. So this, I believe, is a very appropriate topic in our 4th and final class of Purim, and how it all culminates and it all adds in together. First of all, who wrote the Megillah? Let's get that straight. Who wrote the Megillah? So, most are of the opinion that the Megillah was written by Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai and Esther. Some say, that was written by Mordechai and Esther. However, I want to make note, something interesting. Source number 1, the Ibn Ezra. Reb Avram Hasfardi, known as the Ibn Ezra, one of the foremost commentaries on the Tanakh, on the Torah, the prophets and writings. And he says something very, very interesting. He says, you want to know why the name of God is actually hidden? Is because, even though it was written by Mordechai and Esther, it was copied by the Persians and by other nations. So to quote him, this is halfway in, Purim part 2, first source. This is actually the introduction. I'm reading to you, this source is the introduction of the Ibn Ezra to the book of Megillah. So this is before he even starts interpreting the verses. This is his introduction. And I've just taken a snippet out. The word of Avram Hasfardi called the Ibn Ezra. What I deem appropriate to explain is this: the Megillah was compiled by Mordechai, and that the Persians edited and rewrote it in their royal chronicles. Now, as we explained in earlier classes, the Persians were heavy idolaters, idol worships. We said their symbol was who remembers? The symbol of the Persians was the dog. They were the dog. Anyways, they served idol worships. And they would write names of idols instead of the name of Hashem, the name of God. So for example, like they would copy, he says, Kasher also Akutim, the Kutim, who were also idolaters, when they came to begin translating the Torah into their own language, the Ibn Ezra explains, when they came to the very first verse in the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, instead of saying God created, bara Elokim, they said Asima, bara Asima, Asima created. so they included the name of one of their idols. And so therefore, explains Ibn Ezra, it was Mordechai who deliberately, this is based on simple logic, it was Mordechai himself who took out the name of Hashem in the Megillah, knowing that the Persians were going to take it and copy it. So for the sake of God's honor, Mordechai would not include God's name in the Megillah. It makes sense. This was how the Ibn Ezra explains why God's name was not mentioned in the Megillah. What's interesting is that the Marsha, Rav Shlomo Ashkenazi, I believe his name is, another one of the foremost commentaries on the Talmud, he says something slightly different, which is a little puzzling. He says, and I'll quote to you in English, he explains like this. There are several people that we find that they have other names besides the names that they are primarily known for. For example, Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, he had other names, Tuvia, Avigdar, etc., etc. With Haman, we said that his name was really Memuchan. With Esther, her real name was Hadassah. With Mordechai, his real name was Psachia. Interesting. Now it seems, says the Marsha, it's interesting to say, says the Marsha, that the names that they were given are not really their true names, but names given to them for being well known. Because, the Marsha explains, even Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, what was his name? His name was an Egyptian name, named by the princess Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh. She gave him that name. And all these other names, and then he goes on and says, the name Haman, Mordechai, and Esther were all Persian names. And then, this is the main point, he says, the Megillah was written by the Persians. The Megillah was written by the Persians. And that is why God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah even once, because it was the Persians that wrote it. You see, if it wasn't the Persians that wrote it, the names would not be Mordechai, Esther, and Haman. It would be Psachia, Hadassah, and Memuchan. Different names altogether. So, that's the Marsha. Which is a little puzzling. It's a little puzzling. Especially being that in Talmud Megillah, because this is of course a Talmud class, the Talmud Megillah, page 7, side A, which is your second source over here, it says, Lo Meimer de Sava Shmuel Esther Labruch HaKadosh Nemra, Amar Shmuel Esther Baruch HaKadosh Nemra, Nemra Likras Lo Nemra Luchtayv. The Gemara asks, I picked this out of the middle of the conversation, is this to say that Shmuel maintains that the book of Esther was not stated with inspiration of divine spirit? And basically through its question, the Talmud is basically saying, when Esther wrote the Megillah, she wrote it with divine spirit. So the Talmud clearly says that. How can the Marsha, who's only a commentary, argue with a clear Gemara? So the Rebbe explains, the Babich Rebbe gives an insight. He says, no, it's one and the same. Remember the Ibn Ezra? That the Megillah was written but passed on to the Persians copied it and put it into their own chronicles, into their own royal treasuries. The Rebbe says, yeah, that's the point. Not that the Marsha is saying that the Persians wrote the Megillah. What he meant to say is that the Persians documented the Megillah, but it was originally written by Mordechai and Esther. So, getting into the main topic, of what I want to discuss, is the bottom of the page. And this is chapter 9, verse 30 through 32, one of the last verses of the Megillah. It says as follows: And what happened? What happened was dispatches were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the realm of Achashverosh with an ordinance of equity and honesty. This is Mordechai who sent these books out. To do what? Lekayim es yimei hapurim ha'elu bizmanehem kasher kiyam aleim Mordechai ha'Yehudi ve'Esther ha'Malka ve'chasher kimu al nashim v'al zarim divrei hatzomis v'za'akosam. He says, what was sent out to all of the provinces, that these days of Purim shall be observed at their proper time, take note, as Mordechai the Jew and Queen Esther has obligated them to do, and just as they have assumed for themselves and their descendants the obligation of the fast with their lamentations. So we see from verse 31 that Mordechai and Esther obligates all the Jewish people of the land that they should observe Purim at the proper time, including the obligation of the fast of Esther, etc. Now, who instituted that? Mordechai and Esther. Why am I pointing that out? Because the last verse of chapter 9, again, one of the last verses of the Megillah, right after that says, Umamar Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Ha'elo v'nichtav b'sefer. And Esther's ordinance validating these observance of Purim was recorded in a scroll. So the person who was responsible of documenting the story onto what we now have as the Megillah was Esther. Only Esther. What happened to Mordechai? The earlier verse, Mordechai and Esther sent out that the Purim should be observed throughout the lands. The next verse, and who documented it and wrote it down in the book? Esther. What about Mordechai? What about Mordechai? Doesn't say anywhere that Mordechai wrote it down, even though we just said that. What's going on here? So now, this question, I'm going to say the plot thickens. The plot is going to thicken now. Because I'm going to quote to you now Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi. For those who are aware, there are actually two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud. That's the Talmud that we always read. This right here, the Babylonian Talmud. But then there's something called the Jerusalem Talmud. There's the whole different Talmud that was compiled in Jerusalem. That's the green set that you see over there in the middle shelf on top. That's the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. What's the difference? First of all, the Jerusalem Talmud came first by approximately 100 years. The Jerusalem Talmud came first before the Babylonian Talmud. Another difference is that the Jerusalem Talmud is much shorter, yes, much more to the point, whereas the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud that's much more widely accepted, is very, very long. There's a lot. The Jerusalem Talmud, there would be a question and answer and a conclusion, pretty much. The Babylonian Talmud is where we have really delving through question and answer, back and forth, very, very, very exhaustive, what's the right word? Trying to delve into understanding to come to the conclusions. What's the difference? The Babylonian Talmud was written by the sages in Babylon, present-day Iraq. It's interesting, by the way, the Jews lived in Iraq, Babel, for over 1,000 years. They actually compete. It's actually a little bit of a competition as to where did the Jews throughout history live in one place the longest. It could even be even more than Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel itself, is Bavel. Because the Jews lived there for over 1,000 years. Not too many places in the world can we say that Jews lived in one place continuously, uninterrupted for more than 1,000 years. Now that's the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was written by the sages who lived in Jerusalem. So I'm going to present to you first the Babylonian Talmud, giving us some insight into this, followed by a quote from the Jerusalem Talmud. There was Mordechai and Esther presented requests to the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, about Purim. We're going to see that there's a question that is presented to the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish court, that comes in two phases. First phase is the second page of part 2. The second. Okay, just resuming that. It was paused for a second because of internal storage. So basically, in short, the first question submitted by Esther is, establish that for all future generations, the reading of the Megillah is going to be established. She submitted it to the Supreme Jewish Court at the time. Please make it that from now on, every single year, there's always going to be a reading of a Megillah scroll with writing on it, that they read from it in public, the reading of the Megillah. Esther requested this of the sages. Of course, did they agree? Of course. That's why I told today we're reading the Megillah each and every year. But then there's a second thing that she submitted, and that's the second source on the bottom of the page. Rav Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chaviva Masnu. Chaviva over here is a man's name. Etc. etc. She requested of the sages, write to include my book of Esther included. In both, okay, so both quotes from the Bavli. Who is it that requested this? Who requested the reading of the Megillah each year, and who was the one that requested that this book be included in the section of writings of the Tanakh? Esther. No mention of Mordechai. No mention at all. But now on the following page, let's quote the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Jerusalem Talmud says as follows: Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yitzchak me'asu Mordechai ve'Esther. What did Mordechai and Esther do? Kasvu igeres v'shalchul rabbeinu. They wrote a letter and they sent it to our rabbis. Shekein amru lehem, and they presented the following thing to them: Mekablin aten alechen shnei yamim halalu b'chol shana. So should you accept upon yourselves these 2 days to observe each year. 2 days of Purim. We're not going to get into the whole discussion here. They're alluding to the 14th and the 15th. The 14th, because the entire world at the time celebrated the 14th of Adar as a day of festivities, but the people of Shushan, the capital, kept fighting until the next day, the 15th, so they only observed the festival of Purim on the 15th. But basically what they presented in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, was that Mordechai and Esther both submitted to the sages to observe a holiday of Purim. So now, we see that there were 3 requests that they submitted to the Supreme Jewish Court. Number 1, there should be a reading of Megillah each year. Number 2, that the book of Esther should be included in writings, in the Kesuvim, in the Tanakh. And number 3, that there should be a holiday of Purim set as a proper Yom Tov. And we see that all 3 of them were accepted. There's only one thing, by the way, that Mordechai requested that was not accepted, and that was he literally requested that it should be a real Yom Tov. Like we have a Yom Tov of Sukkot, we have a Yom Tov of Pesach, Passover, we have a Yom Tov of Rosh Hashanah, we have all of these different Yom Tovs where we actually refrain from work altogether, and we wear Yom Tov clothing, etc., etc. So we don't work at all. That was the only request that was turned down by the Sanhedrin. However, we do sort of fulfill that, because there is a thing that on Purim we actually try to refrain from work. We try not to go to work that day. We're still driving a car. We're still pulling out our cell phones. We're still doing all of those things. But we try to minimize the amount of work, kind of like Chol Hamoed, kind of like the intermediary days. And of course, there is a custom. There is a thing. If you're not dressing up in costume, there is a concept to wear Shabbos clothing. In fact, it's actually brought that it's a custom to wear Shabbos clothing by nighttime when you're hearing the Megillah, to come in Shabbos clothing. And there's a concept that when you come home on the night of Purim, you come home to your house, there's a custom that the candles are lit, the table is clean, the beds are made, your house looks like it's been cleaned for Shabbos. There is with everyone with the shalchman sprung all over the dining room table, it's a little difficult to say that. But there is a concept that, we try to dress nice. It is a half a Yom Tov at any rate. But basically, I'm going to present 2 questions to you and move a little quicker. I'm going to present 2 questions to you, and that is, why are the requests divided? First of all, why is it that in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, only Esther is making the requests, not Mordechai? It's only in the Jerusalem Talmud where Mordechai is mentioned. It's first of all. It's even more puzzling that Mordechai himself, by the way, was a member of the Sanhedrin. He himself was a sitting judge on the Supreme Jewish Court. So he wouldn't be agreeing with Esther when Esther makes the requests, and yet his name is not mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud at all. Where was Mordechai? Esther is mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud. It says Mordechai and Esther. But in the Babylonian Talmud, only Esther is mentioned and not Mordechai. What happened to Mordechai? He couldn't be on her side. He was there. He was sitting in the room when she requested it. He was one of the judges of the Supreme Jewish Court, of the Sanhedrin. What happened to him? A second question. Why is it that the reading of the Megillah and the request for including the book of Esther in writings, only those questions are mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's only the Jerusalem Talmud that the request that there should be a festivities, a holiday of Purim, for all generations. Why is that requested in Jerusalem? In other words, if these three requests were submitted, why are they not included all in the Babylonian Talmud or all in the Jerusalem Talmud? Why have they been divided, one for the Jerusalem, one for Babylonian Talmud? So those are two questions. What happened to Mordechai in the requests about concerning the Megillah itself? And why are the requests split up between the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud? What happened over here? Why were they split up? So basically, in short, let's put it like this. We have to understand Mordechai's role, and we have to understand Esther's role. And based on the last three classes, we can understand Mordechai's role and understand Esther's role. Mordechai's role the entire time, Mordechai had nothing to do with Achashverosh. Mordechai had nothing to do with Haman, although he didn't bow to him, he instigated the whole story. But Mordechai didn't involve himself with any of that. And even when he was sitting by the palace gates, it was only to correspond with Esther. But Mordechai had nothing to do with the echelons of the government. When Mordechai first heard the news that the Jewish people are in danger, what did Mordechai do? He put on sackcloth, put ashes on his head, went out into the streets, motivated the people to stand and repent, to fast and to pray. His whole role came from a spiritual stand. It was all spiritual. So much so that he gathered 22,000 children under the age of Bar Mitzvah. They began learning Torah. Haman saw them. He was angry. He wanted to kill them. They said, we'd rather die with Mordechai. It was all about a spiritual elevation. And it makes sense. It makes sense because we see the next source over here tells us what is the whole reason why the Jewish people were being punished. Why was there such a heavy threat on their shoulders? This is a question that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked of his students, and the students answered back, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but they quoted back, is it because the Jewish people partook in the feast of Achashverosh? A very famous Gemara, a very famous Talmud. So we see over here that they're being punished for partaking in the feast of Achashverosh. What was so wrong? The Jewish people at the time, they were so steeped deep, they were so oppressed at that time that they were desperate for any type of recognition or attention. And when the king invites you to a feast, they were ready to give up everything. Forget the yarmulke, forget the mezuzah, forget about Judaism, forget about prayer, forget anything. They theoretically, our Medrash tells us, that Achashverosh offered them kosher food at the feast, but they didn't even bother, by the way, they didn't even bother to ask for kosher food. Kosher food was available, because he wanted, the Megillah tells us, Achashverosh wanted to give the feast to the will of each and every person, and our sages tell us that means even to the Jew, he made sure that there was glot kosher food. But, by the way, the Jews did not rush towards the kosher food. They said, forget Shabbos, forget everything. The king wants us. So they submitted themselves entirely to the king just for the sake of attention. So they really stooped low. So God, based on that reasoning, that's why God threatened them with Haman. Haman says, no, Yeshna am echad mefuzar mefayer bein ha'amim. Haman came along and gave the Jews a good knack in the head and gave them the message, you think that you're ready to give up everything to become one of us just for attention? No, you want to give up your Jewish identity just for the sake of some recognition? You can never get rid of your Jewish identity. That's what Haman basically told them. He says, you are a Jew, and that's your identity, and you cannot hide from it. So Mordechai's reaction to that was to say, okay, so what is the situation? The situation is that the Jewish people until now had no Jewish pride. They were ready to give it up for anything. So Mordechai said, what is the solution to all this? How do we repent? We need to have Jewish pride. We need to instill Jewish pride. And the truth is, this is what Purim is all about. If someone is to ask of you, what is the Jewish holiday of Purim in a nutshell? What would you answer them? It's a celebration of who we are. The fact that we are, that is the festivities of Purim. The fact that we have Jewish pride, the fact that we stand proud for being Jewish. Mordechai taught us that. But the point I'm bringing over here is that Mordechai was all about the spiritual sense. He came from spirituality. Esther's role was the exact opposite. After all, with all of the prayer and fasting, who actually got up and walked into Achashverosh's palace? It was Esther. Who was the one who ended up actually pleading to the king on behalf of the Jewish people? It was Esther. Who was the one that put the life on the line for the sake of the Jewish people? It was Esther. So Esther was all about the physical, the mundane, the tangible. push come to shove. Mordechai was all about the spiritual sense of things, motivating people to repentance and returning to God and instilling Jewish pride. But who was the one who was actually putting the life on the line and doing the physical matters on behalf of the Jewish people? That was Esther. So Mordechai represents the spiritual, Esther represents the physical. And these two roles, basically, I'm basically bringing things to a close. These two roles play out in their requests. You see, Mordechai is only mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud. Because the Jerusalem Talmud, what makes them different than the Babylonian Talmud? So, I think it's appropriate. Here's a quick story. Here's a story of the Alter Rebbe. The story will help us understand this. There was one child that was very, very clever. A very clever child, a genius. And he outsmarted all of his teachers. And the problem was, the more Torah he learned, the more arrogant he became. I'm smarter than everybody. No one can challenge my genius. The father didn't know what to do. The father decided that from all the people around, there's one person to take this child to that can help him, fix him up, the Alter Rebbe. Shazam Liadi, first Chabad Rebbe. So the father takes the child, travels to Liozna, where the Alter Rebbe resided, and took him in for a private audience with the Alter Rebbe, and sat him down in front of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe Shazam Liadi looked at the boy and said, and went over to, without saying a word, went over to the shelf, pulled out a book, which was the Rush, Asher, Rabbeinu Asher, one of the commentaries of the Talmud and codifier of Jewish law. And he opened up the book and turned to the child and says, here, this little paragraph, read for me. Read it for me. The child read it. With his genius, he got it right away. He understood it. It was basically presented a halachic ruling, bringing a source and bringing a reasoning for it, bringing a proof, a supportive argument, proving this point. So the Alter Rebbe, he turns to the child and says, do you understand? The child says, yes, yeah, I understood what it says over here. The Alter Rebbe says, strange, because this proof seems to be a weak proof. Because there's another source, and the Alter Rebbe proceeds to tell him another source, and the source seemed to be much stronger and much more concrete of a proof, much more of a supportive argument than the opinion given by the Rush. So he tells the child, this seems to be a much better proof, is it not? The child says, yeah. And you know what? I could bring you a second proof. Another proof from a different source in the Talmud, which is also very, very strong and very concrete, much more of a supportive argument than the proof given by the Rush. And he gives it to him. He says, do you agree? You agree with me? The child says, oh yeah, I agree with you. That was also a very strong proof, better than the proof given by the Rush. And Alter Rebbe says, no, I'll even go even further. I'll give you a third source from another place in the Talmud. And he continues, and he goes ahead and he gives them strong, concrete, supportive arguments, supporting the halachic ruling of the Rush, that these supportive arguments came from sources which seem to be better than the opinion given by the Rush himself. Gave him 3, proof number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Gave him 10 different Talmud sources telling him all of these are much more concrete, more powerful. Do you agree? And the child says, yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Then Alter Rebbe turns to him and says, but you know what? That last argument, it's weak. It's not good of an argument because it could be refuted. And then he went ahead and explained to the child how it could be refuted. And then he started going backwards, demolishing every single one of those 10 proofs. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Demolished every single one of them. And each time he said to the child, do you agree with me that perhaps this is not good? The child says, yeah, I agree with you. He goes all the way back to number 1 and he says, and to conclude all this, the proof given by the Rush, even though at first it didn't seem like the strongest one, that is the only proof that could not be refuted. That there's no reason to refute it. So therefore, even though it didn't seem to be the strongest supportive argument, but that was the one that could not be refuted. Perhaps this is why the Rush made that his answer. Do you agree with me? Child said, yes. Alter Rebbe turns to him and says, child, you really think you could learn? You think you can learn? You can't learn. All this time I was talking and you just said, I agree with you. You did not contribute anything. And the Alter Rebbe goes even further and he says, do you think that the Rush himself, Rabbeinu Asher, thought about all of these 10 other sources and refuted them in his mind before putting this one out? Do you really think he went to all 10 sources? The Alter Rebbe told him, no, he didn't. He didn't. He says, because and Alter Rebbe says, let me give an example. Imagine a person's walking into a room. And he needs to get out of the room. The problem is that person is blindfolded. Or it's dark. The person can't see anything. So they start moving around, putting their hands, groping. They try to find their way around towards the door. They find one handle, they open it up, it turns out to be a closet. They go to another place, they pull a handle, it turns out to be a cupboard. It turns out to be it turns out to be this thing or that thing, or a window opener. And they keep walking around and they can't find it until finally find the very, very end. They find one handle and they open it and realize that's the door, and then they make their way out. Then there's the second person that goes into the room, but the light is on. If the light is on, they walk in, they see where the door is, they go straight to the door, they walk out. So the Alter Rebbe turns to him and says, that's the difference between the Rosh and me and you and I. By you and I, we had to go through all 10 other sources to try to figure out the right one, and it's only then that we realized why that one was the correct answer. By the Rosh, the light was on. By him, all 10 others didn't even enter into his attention, because for him, that was the right way to go and ended up being the right way anyways. So the Alter Rebbe basically told him, so when you and I read, we should understand that we are reading, groping around in the dark while the Rosh is with the light on. The practical application for us, that is the difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. By the Jerusalem Talmud, where was it compiled? In the land of Israel, in Jerusalem. The light is on in Jerusalem. They have the spirituality, and in the land of Israel, everything is crystal clear. And so for them, they see the straight path. This is the question, answer, conclusion. It's right there staring at us in the eyes. By the Babylonian Talmud, they're living in Bavel. Babylon, Bavel actually comes to the word Bavel, means confusion. It's dark. We have to find our way through the dark to find the answer. That is why the Babylonian Talmud is question, answer, back and forth. Now the truth is, let me ask you a question, and with this we'll try to conclude. Let me ask you a question. Who appreciates the door much more and the purpose of the door? The person who went straight towards it with the light on, without thinking went straight through the room and opened the door? Or the person that through process of elimination, trying every other handle, came to the conclusion that that one is the door? Who appreciates the door for its purpose more? The person in the dark or the person in the light? The person in the dark. The other person didn't give it much thought. They see the door, they walk out, they didn't think about it. The other person who tried every other handle in the room appreciated the handle of the door for what it was worth. This analogy I just gave explains why we focus on the Babylonian Talmud much more than the Jerusalem Talmud. Because even though the Jerusalem Talmud is so much more short, concise, and crystal clear, but we appreciate things much more when we tear something apart and elaborate back and forth until we come to the conclusion, and then we realize this is the conclusion because there's no other way to it. We appreciate the answer much more. We appreciate it much more for what it's worth. And that is why it's actually the Babylonian Talmud that we associate with, and it's much more connected to us than the Jerusalem Talmud. Not to negate the Jerusalem Talmud in any way, but that's why we relate to the Babylonian Talmud much more. This explains Mordechai versus Esther. Mordechai was much more on a spiritual, lofty level. So when he was requesting of the Sanhedrin, he was requesting a holiday, a festivities, almost like a Yom Tov, moving yourself away from the world and getting into spirituality. That's why he's only mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud. However, when he was sitting on the Sanhedrin, he took off his regular hat and he put on his Sanhedrin hat as a judge. And as a judge, he realized, when I sit and judge, I have to remove my own personal things and I have to think about the broader picture. And as a judge, he looked at Esther and he says, Esther, you're the main deal. You're the real deal. Because in life, everything that we do in life is all about bringing spirituality into physical, mundane matter. It's all about the action. At the end of the day, everything's about the action. What are we doing? Something tangible. And so it's only Esther who requests, the festivities are all nice and fine, but I want something concrete. I want a Megillah. I want something written on parchment. That's going to be something physical that gets pulled out and read from each and every year. Not only that, but I want it included in writings. I want it to be written and documented. Because she was all about the physical. She was always about doing something action, doing something purposeful, bringing spirituality included into physicality. Which, by the way, is why women are the main objective of this world more than men. If you think about the divinity of the way the men and women bodies are created, women are much more in tune with godliness throughout the entire life. Men, we have one mitzvah that we do with our body, and that's circumcision. And we do it once in our life and we're good to go. First of all, we're not created with it, we're created without it, and we have to put it on ourselves. After that, every time we have holiness, we have to wrap ourselves in that holiness. Putting on tefillin, wrapping ourselves in the towels, etc., etc. We're putting it, adding it onto our bodies. A woman, first of all, is created without the need for a bris or circumcision. And every time, whether she's going through a menstrual cycle, when she has a child, when she's nursing, every step of her life as she's going, she's doing another thing that's connected with the mitzvah, etc., etc. She's constantly in tune with God, something more than the men are. So it's all about action. I could give many examples of it. But basically, the women are much more tangible. They're much more in tune with bringing godliness and bringing it into action. So therefore, Mordechai, who was sitting on the dais, who's sitting on a part of the Sanhedrin, he pointed at Esther and says, "You, Esther, it's all about you here." And now we understand why Mordechai is mentioned in Jerusalem. Why is it that their requests are divided up? Why are they divided up? Because the Jerusalem Talmud, their request is much more of the spirituality, the loftier part of things, the festivities of Purim generally, the mitzvah that we do on Purim. It was Esther in the Babylonian Talmud, the one that we relate to much more, something much more tangible, the back and forth, something that we relate to, and it's much more apropos for us. That's why it's Esther only in the Babylonian Talmud, and that is why she is requesting. That's why she was the one requesting over there. And that is why, in conclusion, going back to the verses in chapter 9, now we have a better understanding of everything. Because, what did chapter 9 say? That in the festivities of Purim, it says, Kiyam aleim Mordechai Hayudi ve'Esther Hamalka. The festivities of Purim were both requested by Mordechai HaYehudi and Esther. However, who was it that Divrei HaPurim ha'elu v'nichtav v'sefer, says the Megillah? The words of Purim are going to be written into a book, into a scroll. That verse, it was only Esther. Umamar Esther Kiyam. It was only the word of Esther that was written and documented down, including in the book. Why? It was Esther's idea. She said, festivities, Yom Tov, it's all a nice thing, but we need something tangible. Especially when we are experiencing longevity of the Jewish people, the fact that we are living through generation after generation, and the story of our survival, it's all about being who we are, about bringing something tangible, taking something spiritual and bringing it to the physicality. This is why Esther gets the credit, and that is why the Megillah is called Megillas Esther, and not Megillas Mordechai. Mordechai gets no mention. Even though he assisted Esther in writing it down, Mordechai and Esther together wrote the Megillah, Esther gets the credit because she was the one that insisted that it should be written and documented in the annals of history for all of us to remember throughout time that we always need to do a mitzvah in a tangible way. With this, we conclude the 4th series on Purim. Next week, Thursday, is Purim itself. There's no Talmud class. The week after that, we go right into the Passover series. It's been posted already. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Purim, a happy Purim, and hopefully with the 4 classes we go into Purim with a lot of festivities, with a true inner meaning and purpose. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Good night, Rabbi.